This is Seymour Rocks reporting from Down Under. I just want to briefly talk about climate change denial as I see it, because Radio New Zealand has come out with this item from Media Watch, which airs on Sunday mornings. And it's talking about coverage of climate change, and they point to Stuff, which has actually been doing far better coverage, way better coverage than Radio New Zealand ever has. So they talk about kind of the climate change denial, while Radio New Zealand are blameless because they talk about climate change. Well, what is the climate change that they're talking about? So usually their coverage is, I was told some years ago that the editorial policy of Radio New Zealand was to only coverage global warming when it had a local aspect to it. So local is surely Antarctica, but of all the terrible headlines about what's happening in Antarctica, not one word of it has been mentioned by Radio New Zealand. Not one word, and very scant coverage elsewhere. And likewise, I've been observing just kind of how warm the weather is. I mean, several degrees. We haven't had a single frost here. I mean, it's absolutely abnormal. You'd have to be a fool or born yesterday not to have noticed it. So this article goes on, and then they talk about how radio hosts are sort of deniers and so forth. And of course, they don't talk about themselves, Radio New Zealand, at all. Not a single word, which I find highly disingenuous. In fact, to some extent, in a funny sort of way, the crude climate change denier that comes from certain circles, probably not from the media, but just from ordinary people, actually points out some of the double standards and even the lies that come from the official thing. So what does Radio New Zealand mean by climate change? It's always connected with something that has a solution, which is usually electric cars. It's always about sea level rise, so they're able to put it they're able to kind of put it somewhere in the future, although not nearly as far in the future as they were a year ago. So to me, that is all a very subtle climate change denial, and I've been battling Radio New Zealand for almost as long as I've been following this. It's absolutely disgusting. I find this article totally disingenuous because in my mind, the real climate change deniers are not the talkback hosts and things with their comparatively sort of crude and stupid ideas, but in fact, actually, it's the likes of Radio New Zealand, because that's really dangerous. People think that they're speaking the truth where they're not. They're not actually talking. They won't actually talk about the actual specific stuff that is happening. They censor it. And I haven't seen a single item over the years that even begins to address the severity of this problem. So, in the midst of that, of not covering anything from the Antarctica, not covering extreme weather events, certainly not providing any form of context. Blow me down. They published this, and then I noticed that it wasn't from Radio New Zealand. Really, it was from the BBC. But it gave the facts in a very, very different way from a lot of the media that I've been watching. Like even the people like the Washington Post, So what do they say? And this is about the only coverage, some coverage, isolated coverage of course, about the heat wave in Europe. And now they're covering this. Wildfires are ravaging the Arctic, with areas of northern Siberia, northern Scandinavia, Alaska, and Greenland engulfed in flames. So far, so good. Plumes of smoke can be from the fires can be seen from space. Yeah, it's all very kind of factual, and they quote someone as saying that, describing it as unprecedented, and then they ask how bad it is. So they describe that quite well, and then they say, how unusual is this? Arctic fires are common between May and October, and wildfires are a natural part of the ecosystem, offering some benefits for the environment, according to the Alaska Center's website. But the intensity of the fires, as well as the large area that they've taken up, make these unusual. So there's a kind of implication. I mean, this is not Australia. This is the Arctic. And they just don't give only a very kind of faint idea of how serious this is. They don't talk about what the meaning of all of this carbon monoxide and black smoke kind of going around the planet and settling in the Arctic. They don't talk really about the Arctic itself. They don't talk about the melting of the ice. So it kind of paints it as if it's probably a local environmental problem. The only interesting thing here that was new for me was that they described a discussion on Twitter with Russians complaining with two hashtags, put out the Siberian fires and save Siberian forests, trending on Twitter. So that was interesting, and I'm really interested in what local people in Siberia are saying. But in the meantime, we get kind of practical denial, intermittent coverage that provides very, very little context and downplays the whole thing, and nowhere more than climate change in New Zealand. That's sort of something that's kind of vaguely there. It might affect insurance in the future. Perhaps in a generation time we may not be able to live by the sea, but the reality is that these changes have been kicking in for many years, and one example is that the last time I saw what I would call a normal winter here in Wellington was 16 years ago in 2003, and I remember it vividly, and I look back at it with great nostalgia. So yeah, that's my rant for the day. Okay, Seymour Rocks reporting from Down Under.